this unknown killer or associates had been spooked by something and they'd hidden the body in the suitcase and moved it. DNA in those child's bones match up with DNA from some unidentified bones found in New South Wales in 2010. And those bones were found in the Belanglo State Forest. I'm Andrew Rule, this is Life and Crimes. The recent search for a little lost boy called Gus Lamont in the outback area of South Australia reminds us of another awful thing that happened in South Australia more than a decade ago. In fact, it's a crime that spanned several years from the time it happened until the time it was resolved. And that is a case that some listeners will vaguely remember. It's the case of the body in the suitcase. It's the case of a little missing girl whose remains turned up in an old faded suitcase by the side of a highway at a tiny little one-horse town called Wynarka, which is right out there in what they call the Murray Mallee, which is emptied out farming country where the communities have shrunk to nothing much more than a pair of road signs. Just west of Wynarka, on the Kurunda Highway, there's a patch of bush just before the big wheat paddocks start pushing up to the road. And it was there on the 15th of July 2015, so that's just over 10 years ago, that a curious motorist turned up when something caught his eye. This driver wasn't the first to notice the faded suitcase that had been abandoned under a bush. Others had been there over previous weeks and seen it, but no one before had noticed what he saw among the pile of clothes that was scattered around the old suitcase which had burst open. It was a human jawbone, a very small one. When the police arrived, they found the rest of the skeleton was obviously a child's, almost certainly a girl's, judging from the clothes that were also in the case. It took forensic scientists to confirm the police's working assumption that the dead child was a female aged between 30 months and 4 years. What investigators would not say at the time was whether they could extract a strong enough DNA sample from the bones to compare with samples already on record. Obviously, they'd be looking at samples taken from offenders, especially sex offenders. Their assumption, of course, was that it was highly possible the child was a victim of a sex offender and may well have been related to that sex offender. Having DNA in such cases gives police a tool to eliminate or implicate any person of interest. From the police point of view, anyone closely related to the child should be able to unlock the macabre mystery of what had happened to her. South Australia's Major Crime Squad made an educated guess that the person they wanted was probably in their state and quite likely within close range of where the body had been found. They set up a task force called Task Force Mallee, and it began its investigation by door-knocking every house within 25 kilometres of that scene, of the little hamlet of Wynarka. Wynarka permanent residents list of 8 people at this point. The police were conscious of how many notorious murder cases in the past had been ruined from the start by slapdash investigations, and they were keen not to let that happen again, which is a good thing. The task force investigators did not reveal all they knew about what happened to the child because they had to keep some vital details secret, something that only the killer knew and that time wasters did not know. Police interview rooms produced some bizarre and detailed confessions, and not all of them are true. It's a funny thing out in the world that people turn up at police stations and beg to confess and then make long rambling confessions that are totally bogus. And this is one of the problems of investigating notorious crimes. The police knew that the victim was a little under a metre tall, so tiny child, and had shoulder-length fair hair, which would probably describe about half the little girls, pre-kindergarten kids in Australia. They knew she had died extremely violently. Certain fractures suggested she was bashed to death. It looked as if the unknown killer, or someone close to the killer, had covered the body in a pile of clothes, maybe in an empty room or a cupboard or a shed, and then left it for years, long enough to be reduced to a skeleton. Then, probably sometime in 2015, they thought, this unknown killer or associates had been spooked by something and they'd hidden the body in the suitcase and moved it. Whatever the reason, it seems that someone took the suitcase from an earlier hiding place to Wynarka. It was tempting to assume it must have been moved in a vehicle, but that did not tally with a fact that ended up being a red herring, but a fact that at the time seemed a very strong clue. And that is this strange coincidence that in early 2015, between March and May sometime, in the tiny township of Wynarka, which is just a fly speck on the map, 2 of the town's 8 permanent residents, Denise Edwards and Monica Martin, were out walking their dogs when they saw something that stuck in their memory. It was a man, aged about 60, they thought, walking briskly up the main street towards the highway. The man was average height, lightly built and neat-looking, with short grey hair. He was a complete stranger to both women, who are locals born and bred. The most unusual thing about the stranger was that he had a large suitcase and was carrying it rather than wheeling it, as if it wasn't especially heavy. In other words, if it had, a big suitcase can be very heavy if it's full of clothes and shoes and books and things. They're shocking things. But if it only had a handful of clothes and a skeleton of a child, it would be very light. And I think it's fair to say that in modern times, say this century, you could drive around Australia and probably never see someone walking along a highway with a suitcase, carrying a suitcase. It's just not something people do much these days. They have backpacks or whatever. The stranger with the suitcase had been close enough to see both women, but he made no eye contact, made no greeting, which was unusual in the country. When these 2 women told the police about it, it did obviously seem like a really good clue. If they find the man who had been carrying the suitcase and eliminate him, it would be a very good start on an investigation. Meanwhile, of course, the forensic experts are back at the labs. They're doing their best to extract usable DNA from these bones found at Wynarka. The other things they were looking at were the clothes that were in the case and a quilt, an unusual quilt that was with it. The clothing was mostly cheap and mass-produced, and most of it was available all over Australia from dozens and dozens and hundreds of stores like Target and those sort of bargain stores. The most distinctive garment, much more rare really, was a glittery dark blue tutu. There was also one pink slipper-like shoe with a butterfly emblem, the sort of thing that people buy for little girls. Police traced the likely origins of most of the 50-odd items of clothing they'd found, but 5 brand names took longer. There was Sally brand, there was Miss X Australia, there was HF and Gaff, and there was another quite strange one with a long, complicated name. But they found out that the blue tutu was sufficiently rare that only 28 of them had been sold in South Australia in the previous 8 years. But it was the quilt that was found in the suitcase, or near the suitcase, that seemed the most intriguing clue. It was a one-off. It was custom-made, homemade, apparently homemade, from mostly hexagonal patches of bright material, but had been machine-stitched, not hand-sewn. So someone had made this. Now, of course, it could have been made by some relative of the child, a grandmother or aunt or something, or, just as likely, it could have been picked up at an op shop or from some charity group. Either way, investigators were very keen to know who thought they might recognise the quilt and tell them about it, even anonymously. There was not much value in the suitcase itself. It was the Lanza brand of suitcase, which is a budget line, about the cheapest line of suitcases sold by one of the big national luggage retail chains. Police learned that the store gave away a large number of these Lanza suitcases for as little as $9 each over the preceding years. So there were hundreds and hundreds of them scattered around the place, and the chances of tracing one of them were very remote. So as the investigation moved into its second month, so we're now getting very late in 2015, the unknown neat man who carried a suitcase in Wynarka early that year seemed to be the only lead. Every day that he failed to come forward to clear himself seemed to confirm him as a potential suspect. Fair enough, you would think that. But it's a lesson for all of us that you can't leap to those conclusions, because as with so many promising leads, it turned out to be a dead end. What actually happened was the breakthrough that the investigators needed came with 2 calls made within days of each other in October 2015. On the 8th of October, caller number 1267, that's quite a few callers on this case, informed police that the mystery child could be called Candice Kiara Pierce, who had in effect been missing with her mother Carly Pierce Stevenson since 2008, when they'd left their hometown of Alice Springs. A second call, this is soon afterwards, number 1271, so it's only 4 calls later, confirmed police interest in the missing mother and daughter, that is, Candice and her mother Carly, because it seemed that the pair's family and friends had not physically seen them since they'd left the Northern Territory back in 2008. So that's years before, 7 years before. A quick check showed a missing persons report had been filed in the Territory in September 2009, but that it had lapsed after Carly's mother, Colleen Povey, so we've got Candice and her mother Carly, and Carly's mother Colleen, all starting with the same sound. So the little girl's grandmother, Colleen Povey, had reported hearing from her daughter. Now, that was a genuine report by her because she believes she had heard from her daughter. Police were intrigued by the reasons for the family's misplaced confidence that the pair, the missing pair, was safe. But now they had names to work with. They could really focus on those 2 people, the little girl and her mother, both missing for years. The search narrowed drastically. The more the investigators looked, the more they didn't find about Carly and Candice, which reinforced the growing suspicion that something had gone terribly wrong for them. Medical records showed that little Candice had received the usual vaccination shots at 18 months old, but she'd not reappeared in any database in Australia after that. Significantly, she had never been enrolled in any kindergarten or school, which sort of tells you that she's missing, gone missing. Something happened back then, before kindergarten age. Now, the South Australian Police called a media conference on the 21st of October. This is, months after the skeleton was found. And he announced, the lead investigator, that's Detective Superintendent Des Bray, announced that he had DNA evidence to back up what detectives already felt in their bones, that the child's remains in the suitcase were all that was left of Candice. And by comparing the little girl's DNA with DNA obtained from bones found in faraway rural New South Wales in 2010, they'd cleared up a second mystery. So what they've said is, we've just tested the bones from the suitcase. That is certainly the small girl Candice, who hasn't been seen since 2008. And not only that, DNA in those child's bones match up with DNA from some unidentified bones found in New South Wales in 2010. And those bones were found in the Belanglo State Forest, which of course is notorious because it's where the several victims of the terrible murderer Ivan Milat had been found. And these unidentified bones, found in 2010 at Belanglo State Forest, had been named in the media as the Angel of Belanglo, because I think there was a T-shirt or something with Angel on it. But the police didn't know who the bones belonged to. But now the suitcase bones had shared DNA with the Belanglo bones, and what the police had was a scenario where the mother and daughter had both been killed and disposed of 1,000 kilometres apart in two states. And once they'd established that, I think they were very keen to talk to the last people to see the mother and daughter alive, which male person, they would be thinking, had been with Carly and Candelise.
Hi, it's Gary Jubilant here. Do you want a real and raw look inside the world of crime? Well then check out my podcast, I Catch Killers, where I interview people from all sides of the law.
I draw my firearm and I went into fight mode. I wanted to find and confront this gunman.
I'm not getting verbal, am I?
I shouldn't have trusted you. See, I'm trying to open my mind up to defence.
I know, it's just begging to be said.
Yeah, fair call. We have amazing guests every week. Search for I Catch Killers wherever you get your podcasts.
Now, it didn't take the police long to work out that they were probably looking for a fellow called Daniel Holdom. That's Holdom. Holdom, not Holden as in car, Holdom. And to go back and work out what probably happened. One of the reasons the police had such good DNA results was that they were able to obtain a tiny sample of Candelisa's blood from her medical records. So they weren't just looking at these old dry bones that had been kicked around out beside a road somewhere. They were able, once they knew who it was that they were probably looking for, that is Candelise, they were able to access her medical records. And in the medical records was a tiny sample of her blood, which gave them really good DNA results. And that led them to the match-up on the database with her missing mother, Carly. So the scenario is now doubly sinister. Two apparent murders, young mother and then her daughter, bodies dumped 1,000 kilometres apart. The police go looking for their prime suspects. They found a witness who had seen Candelise and her mother at Adelaide's Marion Shopping Centre in November 2008. Now this witness, who was not a bad person, this witness who's helping police at this stage, photographed Candelise in a pink dress identical to that found in the suitcase. So that was a great piece of evidence for the police to get. Police also obtained photographs of Candelise in a stroller, a pusher, with the handmade quilt that had been found in the suitcase. Each of these finds moved them closer to the people they wanted. But even when Detective Superintendent Des Bray was outlining the facts at his big media conference on the 21st of October in Adelaide, he already had a suspect in mind, and he knew that that suspect was in fact behind bars on unrelated charges. Surprise, surprise. Top Adelaide crime reporter Nigel Hunt, one of our colleagues here at News Corp, broke the story next day. Nigel Hunt is one of the great South Australian news reporters of all time, and he was able to tell the world that police had identified a man who'd been seen with Carly and Candelise around the time they'd last been seen. It turns out that Carly's family, that is her mother and I think her grandmother, had falsely believed that the missing pair was still alive because they'd received text messages from Carly's mobile phone purporting to be from Carly. Naturally, when you get a text message from somebody's mobile phone, you tend to think it's from them. And on one occasion, one of these texts had been a begging letter for money from home, which was sort of classic Carly behaviour anyway, so they believed it. They had obligingly placed money in her account from which it was then withdrawn. So, they were, Carly's out there somewhere. She needs some money, we'll put some money in her account, and it's been withdrawn. Happy days, she's alive somewhere. Now, in the 7 years from when Carly and Candelise were last seen on the Stewart Highway just south of Coober Pedy in November 2008, until the suitcase bones were found at Wynarka in 2015, that's a 7-year gap, $90,000 had been harvested from Carly's bank account because her bank account was replenished by her Centrelink payments. And this is all very Snowtown, very similar. It says a lot about the depravity and greed of some people, that someone had killed a young mother, probably before her 21st birthday, presumably to steal her benefits money, which of course is much like the Snowtown killers had around Adelaide a few years earlier. And if killing Carly, young mother, 20, 21, whatever, wasn't sickening enough, the killer had then murdered her tiny child. It's hard to imagine a more cold-blooded crime. If one death wasn't premeditated, if it was a crime of passion or, whatever, the other one surely must have been premeditated. If there was one small mercy, it was that Carly's mother, Colleen, had died in 2010 not actually knowing that her daughter and granddaughter had been murdered so foully. The killer's cruel trick of sending false messages on Carly's phone was a sort of an accidental kindness. It had lulled her mother, her worried mother, into believing they were safe out there on the road somewhere, out there on the road to nowhere. Okay, for the police, having a prime suspect exactly where you wanted him, that is, behind bars on other charges, was one thing, a good thing. But proving the case against him was another. So the police worked out that the victims, mother and daughter, had visited Darwin, Alice Springs, Adelaide and Canberra at different times. They appealed for people from those places and the routes between them to think about possible contact and to think about who was with them. Who was the last to see the victims alive? This is always the big question. Police asked hotel and caravan park owners to check records for Carly Pearce Stevenson and for landlords to check leases for the same or similar names. They also appealed to the public to study photographs of Carly and Candelise and scan their memories of whether they'd seen either of them. So while friends and family of Carly and Candelise started an online appeal to bring home their remains and to give them a decent farewell, the police doggedly built their case against the man in jail. We can now name this fellow openly in a way that we could not do back in 2015 because at that stage, of course, he faced looming murder charges. Daniel James Holdham, he was then 41 in 2015. The police were able to establish that his mobile phone use put him at both crime scenes. The mobile phone triangulation put him at both scenes. Very, very good evidence. But there's a more sinister thing. When the police looked through Holdham's belongings, they found a digital camera. And in the digital camera, they found a data card. And on the data card, they found an image of Carly's body. Holdham had killed his, so-called girlfriend by stomping her to death, essentially, a brutal, brutal murder. And he'd taken a trophy photograph and he kept it and the police found it. This would seem to be overwhelming evidence. And so it proved to be. He was arrested in jail, in prison in Cessnock, and he appeared by video link within days. Now, back when we were writing about this story back in 2015, we weren't naming him and he's had charges to face. But the reality is that he eventually worked his way through the court system. And in 2018, just before the day before, 2 days before he's due to appear in a Supreme Court to face double murder charges, he pleaded guilty. and was locked up for a very long time. You'd like to think that he was locked up with people that would take offence at his offences, but we'll never know. There's a few sort of postscripts to this story. Look back on, without exploring the relationship between the victims and Hold'em, one thing is overwhelmingly clear. As with so much crime, at every level, from the top end to the very bottom, street crime, drugs are at the centre of it, in one way or another. The dead are owed only the truth, and the truth is that this little girl, Candelise, even as a baby, was condemned from the time she was born to suffer from the so-called lifestyle choices of those around her, especially, but not only, her mother. Reporters who uncovered a photograph of Carly as a 6-year-old, this is Carly, this is the mother of Candelise, they found a photograph of Carly as a 6-year-old, and reporters were struck by the similarity with Candelise, that the mother and daughter looked so similar. It was hard to believe, one reporter wrote, that the child with her strawberry blonde hair and angelic face, gazing at the camera as she blew up a balloon at a birthday party, would so soon be drifting to the dark side. That birthday party snapshot was taken in 1994. Just 14 years later, almost to the day, Carly would be dead. Obviously at the hands of the reptile boyfriend, who was heavily involved in the drug scene and had snared Carly into his world when she was a rebellious teenager with no real friends. Police came to believe that Carly had run up a $25,000 drug debt in the months before she was murdered. In fact, they believed that she fled Alice Springs with money meant to buy drugs to be smuggled from Adelaide to the Northern Territory along the inland highway route, which was used by, among others, the convicted Falconio murderer, Bradley John Murdoch, who, of course, has now left us. He's exited the building too. Now, Carly's family knew a bit about drugs. Police told reporters that Carly's grandmother, Connie Duffy, all these names, there's Connie, there's Colleen, there's Carly, and there's Candelise. There's a line here. 4 generations. Police told reporters that her grandmother, Connie Duffy, then 80, was charged with possession of a commercial quantity of cannabis in 2010. Carly had lived with that old woman as a young teenager, so she's had a fractured life, and the dear old granny that she's living with is mixed up with growing dope. A man who was charged along with Mrs. Duffy claimed that Carly had been doing drug runs between Adelaide and Darwin before her murder and had been heavily involved with Hold'em, the man charged with her death. This witness said that Carly had insisted on taking baby Candelise with her when she left Alice Springs, despite pleas from family members to leave the little girl with them. Tragic. And of course the family's fears were well founded. When Carly's grandmother, that would be the one called Colleen, opened the missing girl's mail in late 2008 and noticed her Centrelink payments had not been touched for a fortnight, she immediately suspected something was wrong and began looking for her lost girls. Sadly, however, that worried mother was persuaded by the bogus messages sent from Carly's phone. She was persuaded that Carly and Candelise were still alive and well and interstate, and so she was relieved, as you would be. You're always looking for good news in those situations. And she went down and withdrew a missing persons report after only a few days. So officially, Candelise and her mother officially had only been missing a few days because Granny had pulled out the missing persons report because she thought it was all going to be okay. And meanwhile, as we know, Carly's bank card was used for more than 1,000 transactions at fast food stores and service stations over many years. It does tell us a little bit about how there's probably not enough checks and balances on social security payments? Hard to know. None of this surprised the retired detective who'd led the investigation of the infamous Snowtown murders years before. Retired Major Crime Chief Paul Schramm told reporters that the Snowtown case had been made so hard because stolen identities meant that many of the dozen victims were never declared missing until much too late, if at all. Before Snowtown, he said, police assumed that if someone's social security payments were still being drawn, then that person was probably still alive. Snowtown changed that, but it didn't save Carly and Candelise from bad company that eventually condemned them to death. And that is all we can say about that sad story. Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is Jonty Burton. For my columns, features and more, go to heraldsun.com.au/Andrew Rule, one word. For advertising inquiries, go to newspodcastssold@news.com.au. That is all one word, newspodcastssold. And if you want further information about this episode, links are in the description.